Hello, you are very welcome to this week's review of Doctor Who Series 11, Episode 3, entitled Rosa. This week's episode looked at a very difficult time in history. As some of us, most of us would know, Rosa Parks, for her kind of giving up her seat for a very good reason, something of which is explored in great detail in this week's episode. And there's some it hints at very racial themes that were around in the 1950s? In the 50s and 60s. We were introduced to new characters, some of which might be occurring characters for the rest of Series 11, some of which might not be. It's all up to the showrunners and the executive producers and everybody involved in the making of the series, whether or not they make a return or stay put. But what I found very interesting about this episode was that it was very factual. It was done on an educational basis to try and tell people who might not know who Rosa Parks is and about the civil rights movement a little bit about it and what Rosa Parks stood for before she was arrested for giving up her seat. I found it very interesting. I thought it was very educational from a showrunner's point of view, and of course in the olden days of Doctor Who, when it first returned in 2005 and onwards up until about maybe the beginning of Series 5, I'd say to the end of Series 4, Doctor Who was pretty much almost every 2 to 3 weeks was inside of an educational based story. There are some examples of educational based stories in Series 3, Series 4, and definitely some Series 2. I can give you an example of that now, which was, I think, The Unicorn and the Wasp was one of them, where the Doctor and the companion at the time visited not Rosa Parks, but Agatha Christie. So that was one of them. And there are a few other ones in there as well, I just can't think of them. But to go back to the characters in this episode, we were introduced to Rosa Parks from the very beginning. From the very beginning of the episode, we were introduced to Rosa Parks as one of the main characters of the episode. Later on in the episode, we were introduced to Martin Luther King and what he did with the civil rights movement. We were also introduced to Rosa Parks' husband and kind of how he helped the civil rights movement in a way that kind of got it to what it is today. Yes, there is some very kind of difficult themes in this episode, but again, they are very easily talked about in the episode and give people more of an understanding of what the civil rights movement is, or we'll say is. I think an example of what it was like back in the 1950s, or was it 50s I think it was 1950s, is an example of in the opening moments of the episode where the TARDIS lands in 1950s Alabama, and someone drops their glove on the path as they're walking. These people are a couple, by the way. So I think the wife drops the glove on the ground, and Ryan goes back to say, "Excuse me, you dropped your glove on the ground." He picks it up, and the husband makes a sly remark at him and then smacks him across the face, which would have been acceptable, or because Ryan is black, obviously, and it wasn't a good place for black people in America during the 1950s because of this discrimination against them at the time. So that's an example. Then we have another example of discrimination where they go into a restaurant, where the Doctor and the companions go into a restaurant to order lunch, and they go in, they sit down, and I think one of them isn't allowed to sit down in the restaurant, so they have to go around and they have to go to another restaurant and eat there instead. But I suppose the episode was just trying to get across the fact that it wasn't a very good place for people who were black in the 1950s because of this discrimination against them. And I suppose the civil rights movement kind of helped get rid of that very powerfully, actually, and it seems it worked. To this day, though, there are some parts of America are still a bit racially abusive, if I could discriminative against others, but it's not as prevalent as it was in the 1950s. So as a whole, this episode was interesting. It was very educational from an educational point of view, and I enjoyed the storyline, I enjoyed the plot line, I enjoyed the characters and what they stood for, and it was a very enjoyable episode for me. This week's episode gets a rating of 8 out of 10. Again, going on the cinematics of the episode, how each character was portrayed, and the history it told during the course of the episode, and the character development also. So the 8 out of 10 is derived from those things that I just met, those 4 things that I just mentioned there. That's what the score is based off of. Join me next week when I review Arachnids in the UK, premiering Sunday. Let me just check. Premiering Sunday, the 28th of October, at roughly around the same time as this week's. I'll see you then. Click here for other related videos, and click here for Doctor Who related videos, playlists, and also click down here to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. And also remember to hit that notification button, otherwise you don't get notified by YouTube. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.